So, on the matter of Glen Rose, looking at R.H. Tuttle's quote, University of Chicago, professor of anthropology. So the illustration that Tuttle had chosen to refute the charge of too wide regarding Mary Leakey's tracks likewise refuted that kind of argument with the tracks that we found at Glen Rose. Here it is. The layer that the Burdick track came from was found in False Branch, which is a tributary of the Paluxy River, Glen Rose, Texas. We see here the front end of the track that we had sawed across. And you look at these, go on the internet, and look at the dinosaur under the letter D, dinosaur tracks, and you'll see this. The toe end is now set on the host rock, and now we can see now those grape-sized calcite inclusions both in the host rock and on the bottom of the Burdick track rock. We also did pin selections of the host rock and the matrix from the track and found that they matched perfectly. And so we find that it was not isolated from a different area. We know where it came from. In Lamb and Whitman's book on soil mechanics, we find diagrams that illustrate pressure structures that are formed when pressure is applied in a plastic medium. The structures that were in this Burdick track cross-section were actually better than the actual ones they were able to form in the laboratory. We notice here in the illustration in the textbook where the load is bearing down, the resulting structures go down and out, something like a mustache, talking how this track was actual track and not just carved. In the cross-section of the Burdick track toes, we notice directly under the second toe, especially concentrated under that inclusion, where pressure would have been concentrated. The pressure goes down and out and back up. And then under the toe, next to the little toe, again we find a calcite inclusion. The pressure concentrate, and we find the mustache-type structure. And so again we find further confirmation. This is not carved. It was caused by pressure. But that's not all of the evidence we see at Glen Rose. We also have this, a cat track, 9 inches across. This would have been made by a very large cat, and a large mammal discovered at the same time as the dinosaurs would be just as devastating to the theory of evolution and to the picture presented by the geologic column. They just don't appear at the right time if the geologic strata fiction is to hold up. We see the 4 toes and the pad of the cat beautifully preserved in the fossil. And so the response was, well, this one was carved too. We saw it across one of the toes and noticed that this one did have the striations that were deformed by the pressure, proving again that this was not carved. And then we find this very dramatic fossil, a human finger. We see I saw that finger in the museum. We see very clearly a fingernail type structure and joints indicated. A number of anatomists have been astounded at the precise anatomical detail that we see in this beautiful 3-dimensional fossil. Some have suggested that 3-dimensional fossils are so rare that you wouldn't expect to find such a fossil as this. And yet in Glen Rose we find all kinds of 3-dimensional fossils. For example, a fossil of hundreds of soft-bodied earthworms, completely 3-dimensional. We decided to section this finger fossil, and we see the bone structure delineated from what would appear to be the flesh and the epidermis of the outer edges, on the outer edges. And so added to the other fossil is this beautiful 3-dimensional finger. I actually picked it up. And we find this amazing fossil further down toward London, Texas, near Fredericksburg, again in the Cretaceous, but this time in sandstone, the iron hammer. I saw that too, it's in the museum, which material proves out to be non-magnetic, suggesting that it was formed while the canopy over the Earth was intact, before the influence of outer space radiation. So, What has been so far been found at Glenrose completely falsifies the picture presented by the Geologic column. Notice the statement made by Ernest Mayr of Harvard University, one of the more famous evolutionists of our time, in the Gish-Mayr debate in Evansville, Indiana. And he said, creationists have stated that humans and dinosaurs were contemporaries in time. Were this momentous statement true, the names of its discoverers would thunder down the corridors of time as individuals who made one of the most outstanding discoveries of the 20th century. The implications are also seen clearly by Stephen M. Stanley, a prolific science writer, a paleontologist from Johns Hopkins University, in his recent book, The Evolutionary Timetable. He said, there is an infinite variety of ways in which, since 1859, the general concept of evolution might have been demolished. Consider the fossil record, a little-known resource in Darwin's day. The unequivocal discovery of a fossil population of horses in Precambrian rocks would disprove evolution. More generally, any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory, yet not a single one has come to light. And of course, it won't come to light as long as their eyes are closed and they refuse to see. When you have all the evidence that we summarized just a few moments ago, we have to ask, how much more would a reasonable person need? Beyond that, it gets to the point where it's just not going to see it. They're just not going to see it. But he continues saying, as Darwin recognized, a single geographic inconsistency would have nearly the same power of destruction. Stephen M. Stanley, St. Johns Hopkins University, The New Evolutionary Timetable. Now, these are his terms: demolish, disprove, destroy. As Dawkins of Oxford said, it would falsify the theory if these tracks were together, supposed to be 100 million years apart. And yet we demonstrate that they are together, that they're not falsified or carved, that they're original impressions in the sediment. Well, if the geologic column then does not represent the accurate explanation of what we find, then how do we account for the fossil record, these billions of fossil forms, billions of dead things that are found in rocks laid down by water all over the world? We find an average of a mile to a mile and a half of sedimentary rock containing billions and billions of dead things. Those who founded the sciences of geology and stratigraphy believe that this was done by a single catastrophic event, a great year-long catastrophic deluge involving many different depositional events, many different depositional environments, but in one great year-long catastrophic event. Nicholas Steno is known as the father of modern stratigraphy. In the book I quoted from earlier by Dott and Batten, Evolution of the Earth, that I was taught from at Indiana University, we read on page 24 concerning Steno. Besides correctly interpreting fossils, Steno drew some even more important conclusions about the strata in which they occur. And he was a contemporary with Sir Isaac Newton, for example. The result was formulation of most basic principles of analysis of Earth, for analysis of Earth history. Steno showed great insight. Steno's axioms provide the ultimate basis of practically all interpretations of Earth history, so their importance can hardly be overemphasized. Now, Steno was what's known as a flood geologist. He believed that the complete geologic record was produced as a result of a great catastrophic deluge. However, he wrote the rules that we use today to interpret the strata. Anyone who studies stratigraphy has to memorize his 12 axioms. That's the way to interpret it. And he understood it well enough from his perception that he could write the rules 300 years ago that they still use today. and they haven't really added to it. In other words, this concept, of which presumes a worldwide flood, explains, it fits, it works. A very important book was written almost 30 years ago by Whitcomb and Morris called The Genesis Flood. I read that, and I did a lot of work on there, quoting it from it on this website. The Genesis Flood, building on Steno's work and the work of a number of others, they applied our modern history, knowledge of geology, to this concept of explanation of a worldwide flood. John C. McCampbell, who was professor and head of the Department of Geology at the University of Southwestern Louisiana, a well-known geology school, wrote the foreword to this book. He is a uniformitarian evolutionary geologist and very fairly evaluated the ideas suggested in this book. He says the facts of geology fit this explanation. He said the authors have provided a very strong case for this as an explanation for the geologic record and a very serious challenge to the uniformitarian evolutionary explanation. Another way to say that, more bluntly, would be that my explanation doesn't work and yours does. Dr. Campbell acknowledges that the facts fit the catastrophic view better. Notice the statement by David Raup, professor of geology from the University of Chicago and curator of the museum with the largest number of fossils in America, the Field Museum of Natural History. He says contemporary geologists and paleontologists now generally accept catastrophe as a way of life, although they may avoid the word catastrophe. It is almost comical to listen to them avoid that word because it tends to imply the catastrophe of the Bible that they don't like to talk about. Nevertheless, he says, this is the way of life for the paleontologists today. He said, quote, the periods of relative quiet contribute only a small part of the record. The days are almost gone when a geologist looks at such a sequence, measures its thickness, estimates the total amount of elapsed time, and then divides one by the other to compute the rate of deposition in centimeters per 1,000 years. The 19th century idea of uniformitarianism and gradualism still exists in popular treatments of geology, in some museum exhibits, and in lower-level textbooks. One can hardly blame the creationists for having the idea that the conventional wisdom in geology is still a non-catastrophic one. You know, put it right out there in front of you. It's kind of subtle. David M. Raup, Chicago Field Museum. Likewise, notice a statement by Robert Dott, whom we quoted from earlier, the author of the textbook that I was taught from. In his presidential address to the Society of Economic Paleontologists and Mineralogists, he says, writing in Geotimes, I hope I have convinced you that the sedimentary record is largely a record of episodic events rather than being uniformly continuous. Now the term episodic basically means catastrophic. Episodic is just one of those examples, as Raup said, to avoid using that term. But we understand that what he means, an episodic as opposed to uniformly continuous explanation of geological record, he says. My message is that episodicity is the rule, not the exception. We need to shed some lingering subconscious constraints of old uniformitarian thinking. From these statements, we can see that there has been a change toward catastrophism in the thinking of the geologists. A very dramatic illustration is seen in John Horner's book, Digging Dinosaurs, 1988. He found thousands of dinosaur bones up in Montana, and he writes in this book, judging from the concentration of bones in various pits, there were 30 million fossil fragments in that area. At a conservative estimate, we had discovered the tomb of 10,000 dinosaurs. There was a flood, which Horner indicates was what placed the fossils the way he observed them, all leaning in the same direction. This was no ordinary spring flood.